Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the foundation that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for libertarianism. You can find more about FFF at our website at fff.org. And this is the issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show on the internet that brings you the principled case for libertarianism amidst the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too as we approach our next 4th of July.
Yeah, we've been gone a couple weeks, but we're back stronger than ever. And you mentioned the 4th of July. I think it's a good topic to discuss. We're celebrating the signing of the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776. Truly a remarkable event. But I think the real significance of the 4th of July doesn't really have anything to do with the military battles or the defeat of the English and what was really amounting to a secession of the British colonists from the British Empire. It really has more to do with the principles that were enunciated in this document. First of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that, contrary to what a lot of Americans think, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were not great Americans. And there's a simple reason for that. They were not Americans. They were Englishmen. They were as English citizens as much as we are American citizens. And as such, they were taking up arms against their own government. They were standing against what they considered the wrongdoing of their own government. I mean, this is what we celebrate in terms of patriotism. And these people were exemplars of this concept of patriotism. Not blind support of government. That's not what they were doing. What they were doing was taking a stand against their own government, even to the point that they were willing to take up arms against their own government. But I think the real meaning of the Declaration of Independence lies in the words that Thomas Jefferson used. Because what he was doing was he was pointing out that every person is endowed with certain natural God-given rights. These are rights that pre-exist government. And therefore, people don't have to be grateful for these rights. These rights include life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That phrase had been taken from the works of John Locke, the English philosopher, in his second treatise on government, where he referred to life, liberty, and property. But the idea is that man is endowed with rights that pre-exist government. They don't come from government, and therefore government has no legitimate authority to infringe on these rights, to destroy them, control them, monitor them, regulate them. Why? Because these are natural God-given rights. In fact, as Jefferson points out, it is the responsibility of government to protect the exercise of these rights, not destroy them, not control them, not regulate them, but to protect them. And Jefferson points out that whenever any government becomes destructive of these legitimate ends, or this particular legitimate end, the protection of people's rights, it's the right of people to alter the government, abolish the government, and to institute government that is designed to protect the exercise of these rights. Now, we take that wording for granted these days, but that was and is a revolutionary notion. That the notion that people don't have to be grateful to the government for the exercise of their rights, or the fact that they're endowed with these rights. That government really is a servant as compared to a master over people. Now, I think it's also worth mentioning, this was purely a coincidence, but in that same year, Adam Smith publishes his treatise on economics, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, where he develops the concept of economic liberty, free enterprise. That is, enterprise, not free enterprise as we understand it today, which is a government-regulated or managed economy. What he was developing was the idea of economic activity that is free of government control and regulation. And so we have this concept of economic liberty that starts percolating up from 1776 onward, that says, if people are left free to engage in economic enterprise, to sustain their lives by seeking work in a profession or occupation without a license or a permit from the government, where they're free to enter into mutually beneficial trades with one another, if they're free to keep everything they earn and decide what to do with their own money, that is the key to a prosperous society. So you have these two revolutionary concepts coming together in 1776, the idea of economic liberty and the idea of general liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness and property as natural God-given rights, that come together and form really one of the most remarkable societies in all of human history, that despite slavery and many other violations of liberty, that this was a society that really achieved as close to a libertarian ideal, especially on economics, that one could ever imagine. A society in which there was no income taxation, IRS, Federal Reserve, paper money, drug laws, CIA, NSA, immigration controls, Pentagon, huge, enormous standing army, foreign wars, torture, assassinations. Remarkable society. And at the same time, a society in which the poor were becoming very, very wealthy, a tremendously prosperous society. And so by the time the late 1800s comes along, that's what people were celebrating as freedom on the 4th of July, a way of life that is totally opposite to the welfare, warfare state way of life in which today's Americans celebrate, that they celebrate as freedom on the 4th of July. Now, Richard, I'd throw this question at you. How is it possible that two opposite forms of freedom can be celebrated as freedom by two different groups of people?
Well, let me before I get to that, let me offer another historical perspective. You had contrasted just a moment ago the ideals of liberty as that earlier generation of Americans understood it at the time of the Declaration and the decades immediately after, and Americans today. But let me put that also in the opposite historical context, and that is, what was the world before the Declaration of Independence? For all of human history, recorded history, it was taken for granted and presumed that some men were ordained by might or the sheer nature of force over others. Some were masters and others were servants and slaves. Men had power through either brutal conquest or, having conquered, to passing it on through the hereditary endowment of a monarch to his son, for instance. That was the notion. The government had the authority to restrict what was said, what was written, what was done by the citizenry, to be taxed to any extent that the king or the prince felt he could get away with, without the people finally, under a severe oppression, revolting against him out of sheer necessity. Suddenly, out of this, in those couple of centuries before the Declaration of Independence itself, there began a different notion of what a good and just society would be like, which you related to. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, published in 1689, the emerging of these ideas about economic liberty that were percolating in the middle and later decades of the 1700s, reaching a certain culmination at that point, as you mentioned, in Adam's The Wealth of Nations, published on March 5th, 1776, a mere handful of months, as you were saying, before the signing and the release of the Declaration of Independence of American colonials against their British masters. This was a revolutionary notion. You own yourself. These are rights given to you, as you were saying, from a higher authority. But it's also worth pointing out today, many people would say, God is dead. Not everybody believes in God. That's a dead end. How can you say this? How do you know God exists? And if you say that, how do you know that he gave anybody rights? Parallel with the arguments of Locke, for instance, that these are rights endowed to human beings by their creator. All of these thinkers believed that the same conclusion could be reached through right reasoning, self-reflective thought about the nature of yourself, what you consider desirable and necessary for you to live as a human being. Which one of us wishes to be murdered by their fellow human beings? Which one of us wants to be robbed or brutalized by their fellow human beings? Which one of us wishes to be enslaved by their fellow human beings? Which one of us wants to interact with their fellows and be treated in fraudulent and deceptive ways so another can get something out of us that we otherwise would not give them if we had a more honest notion of what they were offering or proposing? So we can all reflect on that. Each of us wants a right to life. We all want a right to liberty. But we all want to be able to associate with our fellows in honest and fair ways. Now, if that is true, if every human being can reflect upon that in that manner and reach that conclusion, then we could say that a good and just society is such that, given the nature of man, it is obviously consistent with and required in a social setting to recognize each human being have certain inherent and inalienable rights. Otherwise, you return to that system of some plundering and others obeying. And that is what is meant to be escaped by realizing that that is not somehow natural. As an individual, want to be free, secure, and honest in your dealings with others. So both the idea of a higher authority and with the reason which Christians would believe God had endowed man with, his right reasoning just on its own can reach parallel or conclusions anyway. So both faith and reason are the bases of a belief in the rights of the individual. Now that was the founding of this country. This was the founding of this country. That it is individuals who are the masters and governments that are the servants. That each individual is free to live his life as he chooses in his own way, guided by his notions of what might give him happiness, the selection of the ends to pursue, the most peaceful means to apply on your own or in association with others, the free exchange that Adam Smith articulated about to show that, as if by an invisible hand, individuals pursuing their own self-interest will end up in a system of voluntary exchange and division of labor, be guided to serve others as the means to get from them what you yourself desire by offering them something they will take in trade in exchange for what they have that you want. All of these are the ideas of those last decades of the 18th century, the 1700s, and that becomes the foundation stone of what America, what made America, to use a phrase, great, in terms of personal freedom, civil liberty, and economic liberty. Now, that gets us to your last point, and that which you threw at me, and that is, how can we have these two parallel notions of what America is about and what independence and freedom mean? And that's because those statist ideas, those collectivist ideas, had a resurgence and emerged as a counter-revolution against the real profound revolution of liberty against tyranny. And that took the form in the middle and the late decades of the 19th century of two variations on the collectivist theme: nationalism and socialism. The nationalists insisted that the nation transcends the individual. The individual passes away. Does not the nation go on? And the socialists said that what defines you is your social class status, the Marxian conception. Are you a capitalist exploiter or a worker who's oppressed and taken advantage of? And these two counter-revolutions challenged the premises of the individualist philosophy underlying this notion of personal freedom. Two new versions of collectivism. The state transcends the individual. The class to which you belong transcends you as an individual. In fact, the class category defines who you are as a person and identifies what your real and true purposes are and for which you must sacrifice for the higher collective or group end. Now, this battle has been going on in the soul of America for the last 100 in 50 years at least, certainly the last 100 years or 125 years since the beginning of, let's say, the 20th century. And that has been, shall we preserve a society of liberty, or shall we whittle away at the edges this edifice of human freedom and replace it with different building blocks of government guaranteed employment, government guaranteed retirement, government guaranteed healthcare, government guaranteed housing, government guaranteed education, government guaranteed. This has all come to the fore in a very explicit and clear and undiluted fashion in the politics of the last few years, and now into this new presidential campaign that has begun. Donald Trump represents the nationalism that was part of the counter-revolution against liberty, making America great again, to which producers in America and consumers in America must sacrifice through his impositions by arbitrary power of import duties, trade restrictions, bullying businesses to invest in some places, creating certain jobs rather than in other places with other employees. And then the stark resurrection of the ghost of socialism that we see on the political left as manifested in most of these candidates, if not all of them, that are vying for the nomination for the Democratic presidential candidacy. They are explicitly saying, we want socialism. Certainly Bernie Sanders doesn't hide that under a bushel, but the others, without maybe using the S word, all talk about government single payer for healthcare. That's socialized medicine. Government provision of free education. That's the full, even more than now, the full nationalization and government control of higher education. So from kindergarten through the PhD. The government guaranteeing of retirements, the government guaranteeing of jobs, the government guaranteeing, and through a central plan, remaking the environment under the fear of climate change. This has risen to an unbelievably stark and direct contrast. Do we still believe in the principles of individualism and personal freedom and limited constitutional government, or do we believe that the state should be all-powerful to, in the name of paternalistic caring, control, guide, direct, plan, restrict, determine the fate and futures of each one of us as human beings? We are, in a sense, at a philosophical crossroads. The founding principles that we are about to celebrate, or the counter-revolution of collectivism that will be the death of those principles.
Yeah, those are several good points. Let me take it back to the Declaration itself. That when these men signed the Declaration of Independence, and when these English people seceded from the British Empire, they understood something that today's Americans do not understand, and that is that the greatest threat to their freedom was their own government, which was their British government. They were British citizens. So when they formed a government after the Revolution, they brought into existence what was called the Articles of Confederation. And each state was essentially a sovereign nation that was prevailing and would prevail in this revolution. And these different states came together in a confederation. Now they had a federal government, but it was a federal government with very weak powers. The federal government didn't even have the power to tax. And they operated under this form of government for 13 years. Now, this reflected their distrust of government, because they honestly considered that throughout history, the greatest threat to people's well-being and to their freedom is their own government. So when the Constitutional Convention formed, it was with the notion of altering, modifying the articles, because there was problems, there was trade wars between the respective states and so forth. So they got together to modify these things. But instead, in this highly secret meeting, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention come out and propose an entirely new form of government. And that was what the Constitution was about. And people were very leery. They said, oh, no. If we approve this thing, we're going to end up with a government that's going to plunder and loot us, that's going to destroy our liberty, that's going to get us into forever wars, that's going to be assassinating us, executing us without due process. No, thank you. And yet the promoters of the Constitution said, no, 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 you don't have that to worry about. Here, we've got a document that enumerates these restricted powers of the federal government. And, well, okay, so Americans said, okay, that makes sense. They go along with the deal. But they said, but to make sure, we want the Bill of Rights, which really is not a Bill of Rights. It's a Bill of Prohibitions. The Bill of Rights doesn't give us any rights. They understood that. It's a restriction on government from destroying freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, a restriction against killing us without due process of law or taking our property without due process of law. And why were all these restrictions there? Because people were leery of that type of thing being done by their own government against them. Now, if you had told people after the Constitutional Convention that this was the Constitution was going to bring into existence the government we have today, which is a government based on mandatory charity, or what might be called socialism, the idea of government taking money from one group of people who have produced it in order to give it to another group of people who have not produced it, or a government based on a national security state, huge standing army, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, mass secret surveillance, assassinations, including of American citizens, and surveillance of American citizens, and engaged in forever wars thousands of miles from American shores, and coups and assassinations. They would have laughed, because based on their principles as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, that type of government was exactly the type of government they were fearing would happen. They never would have approved the deal. They would have said, no, go back and do your work, modify the Articles of Confederation, we'll keep the federal government that we have that doesn't even have a power to tax. And so here we have these two different concepts of freedom. You have Americans today that truly believe they're free, Richard. I mean, they embody the words of Johann Goethe. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. They live under a system of mandatory charity, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, the whole kit and caboodle of them. The drug war, where they put people in jail for doing nothing more than ingesting a harmful or dangerous substance, and then a huge national security state, which is a totalitarian form of governmental structure. North Korea is a national security state, Egypt, China, and the United States, Cuba, North Korea, and so forth. But you have Americans, now our ancestors truly understood that you can't be free under that type of governmental structure. But today's Americans are convinced they're free. When they have the barbecues on the 4th of July, they're going to be singing paeans to, thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free. And that's the power of indoctrination. That's the reason why government is involved in education. That's why we have a public school system. Because you indoctrinate kids from the time they're 6 years old all the way up 12 years in schooling. You're free. You live in a free society. You have a free enterprise system. A free enterprise system is where you have the government engaged in mandatory charity. A free system is when you have this totalitarian structure. But it's all designed as freedom. And then, of course, the capstone politically was during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, where the entire system was changed to a welfare state, in which they convinced people that this new way of life was saving free enterprise, when in fact it was destroying it. And so what we really, I think one of the big challenges we have, Richard, is getting people to discuss and debate this very important question. What does it mean to be free? What was the concept of freedom that people that signed that Declaration of Independence were fighting for? And how can you possibly define freedom as a national security state, mandatory charity, drug war, regulated economy way of life that we live under today?
Yes, it would be very interesting. They're going to have another one of these, I guess, two-tier Democratic candidate debates later in July. And it would be very interesting if one of the commentators overseeing the debate, of course they won't do this, but to ask each of those Democratic candidates to answer the following question. Could you please enumerate the 2 or 3 areas where you think government is too big, government should not interfere in people's lives, and human beings should be allowed to freely decide the forms of associations with others? I would bet that the immediate reaction of every one of those Democratic candidates on that stage would be blank stares, like, what? And when they composed themselves and their brains were like running wild, they would say, decriminalization of marijuana, having sex with anybody you want, or any animal you want. But beyond these things of most immediate personal freedom, such as the intimacy of the bedroom, abortion, but of course paid for by others, as all of them have now said, or being allowed to smoke marijuana, but not cigarettes, they will have no answer to that. Now, the reason I'm raising this is that shows the mindset of a broad portion of the American population who these candidates reflect. And that is the loss of an understanding or even a willingness to consider that government shouldn't be intruding into our lives. None of them will talk about economic freedom. None of them will talk about restraints on government intrusion into people's lives. Now, they want government intrusion different than Donald Trump wants it. But the premise that the state should be surveillancing, snooping, regulating, controlling, intervening, commanding, restricting, it's all the same. And that is the dilemma that we face. It's also reflected in the fact that in recent public opinion polls, you have close to half the population in the mid 40s in the percentages of people who say that they have sympathetic or positive views of socialism compared to a market-based system. Now, how they're defining market-based versus socialism, but the words. And that just shows the dilemma that we face. We are really in a battle to restore, reclaim, reassert, redefine, and reawaken an appreciation of the meaning and value and importance of liberty. Because as you were saying, as I was pointing out, beginning with the counter-revolutions of nationalism and socialism in the 19th century and accelerating in America following the Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and as you said, the indoctrination of public education, we're now in a dilemma that we are, in a sense, at a philosophical, political crossroads of what does it mean for a society to be free, and which way do the American people really want to go? Because that's the stark contrast they're being offered with the Democratic candidates who are calling themselves these things. And Donald Trump, who's the nationalist. Notice, there is not one voice in either political party right now who represents even a general case for individual liberty and limited government. All of them want big government and intrusive government with reduced personal choice and freedom. They're only arguing over what form and the intensity of the degree.
Yeah, they're all stuck in this statist paradigm. That's why there's really no difference in principle between Trump and any of those Democratic opponents, because they're all operating under the same paradigm. It's a paradigm of socialism, mandatory charity, taking from one person through the IRS and giving the money to another person, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, farm subsidies. It's a paradigm that calls for managed trade, like trade wars and tariffs and sanctions and embargoes. All the Democrats want, they're not challenging that structure. They want to manage it. They want to be in charge of it. They want to put their buddies in charge of the largesse and receiving the largesse. And then you've got the national security state. Sure, you've got some of the Democrats saying, oh, well, maybe we ought to finally get out of Afghanistan, or maybe finally get out of Iraq, or stay out of Yemen. But they don't challenge the fundamental structure. And that's what we really need, Richard. It's not a matter of getting better people into public office. It's a matter of finding enough people that will say this paradigm is a bad paradigm. That if we want the right paradigm, we look to the principles in the Declaration of Independence. A way of life where there is no mandatory charity. Why should somebody be mandated to be good and caring? And how can you even be mandated to be good and caring? It's a society where people can choose what to do with their own money, take care of others, honor their mother and father, but all on a voluntary basis, where people are free to ingest whatever they want to ingest, where there is no managed, regulated economy, where enterprise is free of government management and regulation and control, and in where you have a restoration of a limited government republic, which necessarily means a dismantling of this totalitarian, immoral, destructive structure called a national security state. once people start looking in terms of a paradigm shift instead of trying to get better people in public office, now we're talking about a genuine free market society and a society based on individual liberty and property rights and free market philosophy.
Yeah, you see often when I'm in a classroom and I'm discussing with the students, such as in a course where public policy issues have come up, or I teach a course on markets and morality, ethics, and capitalism, and they'll say, but government should be doing this or government should be doing that as part of this debate and exchange about these ideas. And I say, imagine that government had the authority to do X, Y, and Z that you consider might be desirable. Now imagine that the politician who you hate the most and trust the least is in charge of those programs. Do you want those programs? And I say it's a two-edged sword. What you're talking about is an institutional makeup, the role and functions and intrusiveness of the government. You can never be sure that in the next roll of the dice of an election, that the people you consider good guys, trustworthy guys, humane and caring guys who follow the agenda that you desire will have the reins of power. It could be those who you vehemently oppose. This is the thing, is that Donald Trump at one level is the essence of the political left in America. Do they not talk about Social Security and medical care? Trump proposes to have that. He has told his advisors, anything you propose for reforms in government, draining the swamp, don't touch Social Security or Medicare and Medicaid. The left has said that we must talk about identity politics. We have to focus on gender and race and ethnicity. Well, isn't that what Trump is doing at the border? There are certain people he wants in and certain people he doesn't. He goes on a trip to Europe and he says, why don't we have more Americans that look like Norwegians instead of people from Haiti? But don't the left ask us to define people by being African American, Hispanic, white, male, female, and divvying out favors, privileges, obligations, subsidies, constraints, special policies for these different groups or against these different groups? He reflects that. It is all the same vision of tribalism and groupism at the expense of the individual, and the state divvying up what each tribe is to receive, either based by arbitrary authority. This is what Trump is doing with his stuff at the border and in trade barriers. And then the other one is the left, who wants to use legislative authority to define and categorize and divide Americans and decide who's allowed, who gets, who's prohibited, who has to be taxed, who gets the special subsidy. That's the very nature of the game. They're all reflective of the same collectivism versus the philosophical individualism that was implied in the founding principles of that Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, your point to your classes is very good about imagine the worst person you want in public office, the person you most fear, the most person you despise, and then imagine him exercising the powers that you're willing to give to your candidate. And then all of a sudden you start reflecting on whether that's a good thing. I think it's important to go a step further, and that let's say that a government has the power to assassinate. So an argument can be made, well, I don't want Trump to have that power. I mean, he just can't be trusted with the power to assassinate. I want a Democrat to be in charge because he's more kind and compassionate, and therefore he will assassinate fewer people. And specifically, we're talking not just about Americans, which the government now has the power to assassinate, but also people overseas. But it's important that we recognize that regardless of who you have in office, that is still not a free society. That a free society is one where the government wields no power to assassinate, period. And that's what we need to be starting to talk about in this country, is taking away powers of government. Not so that we're not talking about a benevolent assassin or a benevolent president. We're talking about a president that lacks the power under our structure of government to assassinate anyone. That is, the power to take anybody's life without due process of law. That's then what we're talking about is a free society.
Yeah, that is the institutional premise of how the Constitution was set up. We all learn in school, division of powers. There's the president, there's the Congress, there's the courts. But why was that division of power set up this way? It was precisely to prevent concentration of authority in one branch of government that could do so without a check and a balance and without proper legitimizing authority. Legislative fiscal bills begin in the House. Other bills begin in the Senate. It requires the concurring support. Part of this thinking was not just the institutional thing of reflection and having a second thought and making sure you know what you're talking about, but was to give the ability to limit the growth of concentrated power and arbitrariness of government doing things to the people. The very notion of the Bill of Rights, as that which you were alluding to earlier, Congress may pass no law abridging freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on. Now, it doesn't say a Democratic Congress shall pass no law, or no Republican Congress will pass no law. Congress may. It is the institutional idea that regardless of who is in office, who has been elected to a political position, who has been appointed in the bureaucracy by those who have won an election, the government may not interfere with these liberties. It's not a matter of the right person or the wrong person, good intentions or bad intentions. It's taking the power out of the hands of government to do any of this, and to say that there are areas of human life that belong to the individual alone and in his free and voluntary associations with others, and have no place in the political arena. And the classical liberal view of this is that what is that narrow confinement to government? The protection of each separate individual's right to his life, his liberty, and his honestly acquired property. And beyond that, anything the government does is an abridgment, an invasion, and a threat to the freedom of the people.
All right, on that fine note, we'll wrap it up. Greatly enjoyed this conversation, as always, Richard. And if you'd like to learn more about the Future of Freedom Foundation, this is your first exposure to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. We publish articles every day. We have a monthly journal. We'd like to invite you to subscribe to our daily publication, FFF Daily. And we publish articles by Richard weekly and monthly in our journal. I write a daily blog, and all with this principled approach to liberty. So, Richard, I wish you a happy 4th, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and a happy 4th of July to all of our viewers and listeners in defense of liberty.